The summer had arrived quietly, without ceremony, slipping into our lives like a stray breeze through a cracked window. The days stretched long and hot, and the air inside the house felt heavy with repetition. Nothing ever changed. My routine was simple: wake up late, shuffle to the kitchen in bare feet, drink tap water straight from the faucet, and try to pass the time without thinking too much. My father had settled into his retired rhythm, always moving through the day with the slow patience of someone who had nothing urgent left to do. Our house sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, shaded by large trees, the kind that creaked in the wind but never truly stirred anything. I had stopped expecting surprises. That morning, I was standing at the sink, half awake, rinsing out a glass that was already clean. The kitchen was dim except for a square of light spilling in from the window, painting the floor in a golden patch. My mind was drifting, disconnected from the moment. Then I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel outside, slow and deliberate, followed by the cut of the engine. At first, I thought it might be a delivery truck or a neighbor's guest. I didn't move. But then came the slam of a car door and the creak of our screen door opening, the sound slicing through the quiet like a warning. I froze, glass still in my hand, not quite sure why my pulse had quickened. My father's voice followed. Loud. Familiar. Warmer than usual. There was a kind of joy in it that I hadn't heard in a long time. It caught me off guard. I dried my hands with a towel, slowly, and walked toward the hallway, unsure what I would find. And then I saw him. He was taller than my father by a few inches, broader in the chest, with salt and pepper hair that framed his face in a way that made him seem both dignified and relaxed. His skin was tanned, his movements unhurried. He carried a worn leather bag in one hand and sunglasses in the other, and he stepped into our home like he belonged there. There was no hesitation in him, no awkwardness. Just a presence that seemed to absorb the room. He was laughing at something my dad had said, the kind of laugh that started deep in the chest and lingered. They passed me in the hallway without pause, my father animated and talking with his hands, the man nodding, smiling, listening. I stood back, unsure why I felt like I had been pushed into the background of my own house. There was something about him, something I couldn't place. Maybe it was the way he walked, or the quiet confidence in his face. Maybe it was how naturally he fit into our space, like he had always been meant to return. My chest felt tight, but not in a painful way, more like anticipation that didn't know what it was waiting for. His name was Tom. I had heard about him in passing over the years. My father's childhood friend. They'd grown up together, shared stories and seasons and dreams I would never know. He had moved away long ago, built a life somewhere else, and now, apparently, was taking a break, a detour, whatever excuse people used when they didn't want to call it coming home. I hadn't thought he'd actually come. I hadn't thought much of it at all. But now here he was, walking through our living room like it belonged to him too. I spent the rest of the day trying to stay out of the way. I busied myself with nothing. Moved from room to room with a book I didn't read, scrolled through my phone without seeing the screen. I could hear their voices echoing through the house, my father louder, more animated than usual, and Tom's deeper, slower, more deliberate. There was something about that voice that made me want to sit closer, to listen, to let it wrap around me like something safe and dangerous at the same time. I found myself watching him without meaning to. The way he moved. The way he sat, one ankle resting on his knee, his fingers tapping lightly against the arm of the chair. There was a steadiness to him, a calm that didn't demand attention but commanded it anyway. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, but he wore them like they were made for him. I tried not to notice. I told myself not to. But I did. Every time. Later, when they went outside to fix something in the yard, I lingered by the window, pretending to organize the shelf near the sink. I watched them laugh over something I couldn't hear, my father gesturing wildly, Tom shaking his head with a grin. I watched the way his shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, the way his arms flexed as he lifted a toolbox. It was too hot for this kind of noticing, too bright, too open. But I couldn't look away. That evening, we all sat on the porch. My father and Tom with cold beers in hand, me with lemonade I didn't really want. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting everything in a soft orange glow. They talked. I listened. I watched. I memorized the way Tom leaned forward when he laughed, the way the skin around his eyes wrinkled just slightly. I told myself it was just curiosity. Just fascination. That he was different from anyone I had known. That it didn't mean anything. But that night, when I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, I realized my body was still tense. My mind was still full. My thoughts were circling him like moths around a low, steady flame. I didn't know what any of it meant. I just knew that something had shifted. That the summer, which I had expected to be dull and slow, had suddenly cracked open in a way I hadn't anticipated. Something had arrived with him. Something I couldn't name. And even in that moment, before anything had really happened, I knew there was no going back. The days after Tom's arrival blurred into one another, threaded together by routines that didn't feel like mine anymore. He moved through the house with such natural ease that it was like he'd always been here. Nothing about him was loud or intrusive. He never imposed himself on anyone, never made a show of his presence, but still, everything shifted around him. It was like the house had developed a second gravity, one that pulled everything toward him, quietly, inevitably. I felt it first in the mornings. I started waking up earlier than usual, even though I wasn't sleeping well. Something in me wanted to catch those quiet moments when the rest of the world was still. I would come down the stairs barefoot, the wood cool under my feet, and pause just before reaching the kitchen. Every time, I found him there. Always in the same place. Sitting on the back porch, facing the trees, a mug of coffee in one hand, the newspaper folded neatly across his lap. The light would catch the edge of his profile, the shape of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the faint lines around his eyes. Sometimes he hummed softly to himself, nothing with a melody, just a low sound that didn't quite carry. Other times, he just sat in silence, occasionally lifting the paper closer to his face, squinting at something in the sunlight. He looked so calm, so grounded, and I felt like a ghost hovering in the hallway, unsure whether I wanted to be seen or stay invisible. I often made up reasons to enter the room, a cup I didn't need, a dish I'd already cleaned, just to move through the space where he was. I told myself it was nothing. Just curiosity. Just interest in someone different. But the truth was more complicated. I wasn't just observing him. I was drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. His movements were precise, like everything he did was part of a quiet ritual. The way he rolled up the sleeves of his shirt. The way he set his mug down, always on the same spot of the table. The way his fingers turned the page of the newspaper with slow care, as though the paper might break if he rushed. He had this physical presence that demanded no attention and yet held mine completely. I tried not to be obvious. I tried not to stare. But every time he walked into a room, I felt my spine straighten, my breath shorten, like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. He was different from my father in subtle ways. My dad had a stiffness to him, like years of work had settled in his joints. Tom moved with a grace that came from knowing his own strength, but never needing to show it. Even when he was doing something simple, reaching for a glass, tying his shoes, bending to pick something up, there was control in his body, a kind of economy of movement that fascinated me. He didn't fidget. He didn't stumble. He was fully present in every gesture, every step. I started watching his hands more than anything else. They were strong, sure, lightly calloused. They looked like hands that had worked, fixed, built. I watched the way he gripped a screwdriver, the way he twisted his wrist to loosen a stuck hinge, the way he wiped his palms on his jeans when he was done. It felt strange to notice such details, but I did. I noticed everything. The freckle on his right forearm. The faint scar above his knuckle. The way he stretched his fingers when he stood up after crouching for too long. Mealtimes became their own form of torment. I began waiting to see where he would sit before choosing my place. If he sat across from me, I spent the whole meal trying not to look directly at him, but always catching glimpses, his profile when he laughed, the way his throat moved when he swallowed water, the curve of his smile when something amused him. If he sat beside me, it was worse. I could feel the heat of him, the shape of his body even without looking. Sometimes our knees would brush under the table, just a tap, just a flicker, and my skin would flare with awareness. Evenings brought more silence. My father often went to bed early, leaving just the two of us in the living room. Tom usually stayed up, flipping through TV channels without much interest. I would pretend to be reading, though my eyes barely moved across the page. I was too aware of him, of his presence just a few feet away, of the sound of him shifting in his chair, of the faint creak when he leaned back. The television bathed the room in flickering light, casting his features in shadow and gold. I stole glances when I thought he wouldn't notice. The angle of his jaw, the slope of his neck, the calm in his posture. He looked like a painting lit by candlelight, still and unreachable. There was nothing inappropriate in how he acted. He didn't flirt. He didn't linger. He didn't say anything he shouldn't. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when I felt something unspoken pass between us. A glance held a fraction too long. A hand that hovered just a second more before pulling away. I never knew if I was imagining it or if he felt it too. That was the most confusing part. The uncertainty. The not knowing. My own body began betraying me. I became hyper-aware of how I moved, how I dressed, how I positioned myself in a room. I found myself stretching in front of the open fridge, leaning against the counter in ways I hadn't before. I hated myself for it. Hated how much it mattered. But I couldn't stop. I wanted him to notice. I needed him to. Even if I didn't know what I wanted him to do about it. At night, I lay in bed and replayed the day. Every glance, every word, every brush of skin. I thought about him constantly. The way he stood at the sink. The way he stepped out onto the porch with a towel draped around his neck. The sound of his voice when he asked my father about old memories. I imagined what it would be like to sit next to him, to reach out, to feel his skin under my hand. I imagined more than I should have. I dreamed of things that left me breathless in the dark. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something that settled into my chest and made a home there. I felt like I was spinning around him, caught in his orbit, always just close enough to feel the pull, never close enough to touch. And the worst part was knowing I didn't want to break free. I didn't want to resist it. I just wanted to know what it would feel like to fall. Something began to shift, though I couldn't say when it started. It wasn't loud or obvious. It didn't announce itself with words or gestures. It happened in the space between glances, in the silences that stretched just slightly too long, in the air that seemed to thicken when we were alone. It was a slow, almost imperceptible change, like the subtle tilt of sunlight across the floor as the day moved forward. But I felt it. Deep in my chest, in the way my body reacted to his presence, in the way I started anticipating moments that hadn't even happened yet. Tom had this way of watching me that never felt intrusive. His eyes would settle on me for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then flick away like nothing had happened. But I noticed. I always noticed. Sometimes I'd be reading on the couch, pretending to be absorbed in the pages, and I could feel his gaze land on me from across the room. It was soft but focused, like he was trying to figure something out. I would look up, slowly, just in time to catch him glancing away, his expression unreadable. It wasn't frequent, but it was enough to make my breath hitch every time it happened. In the kitchen, our paths crossed more often. I started counting the times our arms brushed as we reached for the same drawer or passed behind one another. His touch was always brief, always casual, but it stayed with me long after he left the room. One morning, we both reached for the same glass on the shelf. Our hands touched, palm to knuckle. Just a second, maybe less. But in that tiny space of time, I felt a current, a pulse of something too real to dismiss. Neither of us acknowledged it. We each took a different glass and moved on. But my mind couldn't let go of that moment. It looped on repeat, magnifying every detail, the warmth of his skin, the weight of that glance before we turned away. It became a game I wasn't sure we were both playing. A dance made of proximity and restraint. He never said anything out of line. Never made a move that could be misinterpreted. But there was something behind the way he stood when I entered a room, how his body stilled slightly when I walked past, how his voice lowered when we were the only two awake in the house. I didn't know if I was imagining it, projecting my own longing onto him like a mirror catching sunlight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. I started avoiding certain moments. Not because I didn't want them, but because I wanted them too much. I would hear his footsteps coming down the hall and suddenly find an excuse to step outside or shut myself in my room. The air around him felt dangerous, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made me fear my own reaction. Every moment alone with him was like walking a wire, balancing between desire and control. I told myself it was better not to be near him at all than to let something slip. But it never lasted. I always ended up back in the same rooms, orbiting the same space, pretending to need a drink or a snack or a charger I didn't misplace. One afternoon, I stood in the doorway to the garage, watching him fix a loose panel on the storage shelf. He hadn't seen me at first. He was focused, crouched down, his shirt pulling tight across his back. His arms moved with slow, practiced strength, and I just stood there, transfixed, watching the play of muscle and motion. When he turned and noticed me, he offered a small nod, nothing more. I muttered something about looking for a hammer and backed out of the room, heat rising to my face. My heart thudded hard against my ribs. I had no idea why I kept doing this to myself. No idea why I couldn't look away. The worst part was the shame. I couldn't explain it to anyone. I couldn't even say it aloud to myself. What was I feeling? Why him? Why now? He was older, a guest, someone my father trusted. There were no rules for this, no words that could wrap around it safely. I felt like I was walking through a storm of emotions I didn't ask for and couldn't control. One moment, I was drowning in guilt, the next, floating in a kind of aching, desperate want I didn't know how to name. I started writing things down. Not full sentences. Just fragments. Pieces of him. His hands. His shoulders. The sound of his voice when he laughed. The way he leaned on the kitchen counter with his head tilted just slightly to one side. I wrote these things in a notebook I kept hidden in the bottom drawer of my desk, as if putting them on paper could make them less dangerous. But it didn't help. It only made the obsession more real. One evening, we were both in the living room again. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching. My father had gone to bed, and the quiet between us felt charged. Tom sat in the armchair. I was curled on the couch. At some point, I realized he was looking at me. Not overtly. Not in a way I could call out. But his eyes were on me, and when I met them, he didn't look away immediately. There was a pause. A beat. A moment too long. And then he shifted his gaze back to the screen. It left me breathless. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, the fan spinning shadows across the walls. My body was tense with everything unsaid. I replayed every glance, every touch, every pause. It wasn't just about attraction anymore. It was deeper than that. More fragile. I felt seen, and that terrified me more than anything else. Because if he truly saw me, then he saw everything, the confusion, the desire, the fear. And if he saw it and did nothing, what did that mean? I didn't know where we stood. I didn't know if we were standing at all. But I knew that the space between us was alive now. Breathing. Watching. Waiting. And it was only a matter of time before one of us broke the stillness. The morning felt no different than the ones before it. The same golden light spilling across the floorboards. The same gentle hum of birds outside the window. The same quiet house wrapped in the stillness of a slow summer. But something about the air felt off. Too still, too expectant. I moved through the house like always, but each step felt heavier. I knew before my father even spoke that he would be leaving for the day. Something about errands, groceries, or maybe catching up with an old friend in town. I barely registered the details. What mattered wasn't where he was going, but that he would be gone. And Tom would still be here. Alone. With me. The moment the front door closed behind my father, the silence shifted. It wasn't dramatic. Just a subtle recalibration of the atmosphere. A lowering of volume. A change in temperature. I stood at the window, watched the car back out of the driveway, and felt a flicker of something I couldn't name settle in my stomach. It wasn't fear. Not really. But it felt close. A tightness. A tension. Like the moment before a string snaps. I busied myself with tasks that didn't need doing. I wiped down the counter twice, rearranged things in the fridge, straightened the books on the shelf even though no one had touched them. I could hear Tom moving through the house, footsteps down the hall, the creak of the back door, the soft rustle of tools being shifted in the garage. I avoided going near him at first, staying just out of reach, as though distance could somehow dissolve the gravity that had built up between us. But it didn't. By midday, I found myself in the kitchen again, standing at the sink, staring out the window at the backyard. Tom was there, bent over something near the shed, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the fabric of his shirt. The muscles in his arms flexed as he worked, his movements methodical and slow. I watched him too long. I always did. I told myself to turn away, to walk back upstairs, to disappear. But I didn't. When he came back inside, the house felt suddenly smaller. The walls closer. The floors quieter. I could hear the faint sound of water running in the bathroom, the opening and closing of a cabinet, the steady thud of his feet against the floorboards. I moved through the rooms carefully, avoiding eye contact with his shadow. Every time we passed each other, it felt like something unsaid pressed harder between us. Every glance felt too full, every silence too loud. I could feel the heat of him even when he wasn't touching me. I could smell the faint trace of sweat and soap as he moved past. And still, neither of us said anything. Later, I went out to the porch, needing air, needing distance, but even the outside felt too close. I sat down with a drink, the glass sweating in my hand, condensation pooling under my fingertips. The heat pressed down from above, thick and unmoving, but it was nothing compared to the heat inside my chest. I tried to breathe through it, tried to focus on the sound of cicadas in the trees, on the distant hum of a lawnmower down the street. Anything but the door behind me. Anything but the inevitable moment I knew was coming. He joined me a few minutes later. I heard the soft click of the screen door, the hush of his steps on the porch. He sat beside me, not too close, not too far. Just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. The silence settled between us, thick and charged. I stared straight ahead, gripping my glass tighter than necessary, every muscle in my body locked in place. The air shifted again. A pause, subtle but deep. I turned my head, just slightly, and found his eyes already on me. There was no smile. No expression I could easily define. Just that quiet, steady gaze. The same one I'd felt 100 times before. But this time, it didn't look away. He moved first. Not fast, not bold. Just a small, careful motion. His hand brushed against mine, barely there, just the edge of skin against skin. I didn't pull away. My fingers remained still, trembling slightly, the glass slipping lower in my grip. I felt the world tilt, slow and irreversible. We sat like that, still, as the heat thickened and the shadows lengthened across the porch. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting the sky in streaks of amber and pink. I couldn't speak. I didn't want to. Everything I wanted to say was in the air around us, in the way my heart pounded, in the way I couldn't breathe right. When his fingers finally closed around mine, gently, like a question, my hand responded without hesitation. The glass slipped from my grip and landed softly on the wooden boards beside us. I didn't even hear it. At some point, we stood. I don't remember how. I don't remember the exact moment we moved or what my face looked like when he reached for me. I just remember the hallway, the faint creak of the floor, the way the house seemed to hold its breath with us. We ended up in the guest room. The door half closed behind us. The light dim, the air heavy, the room still. He looked at me like he was waiting for a sign, but I had nothing to give but the truth in my eyes. I stepped closer. His hand found my arm. The touch was steady, warm, and I felt myself lean into it before I could think. When our lips met, it was slow. Careful. It didn't feel like seduction. It felt like surrender. A giving up of every fight I had waged inside myself since he arrived. I didn't think of the consequences. I didn't think of what this meant. I thought only of the way his hands felt on my back, the way my body answered his without hesitation. Everything after that blurred. The way the bed dipped under our weight. The way the air shifted as clothes were removed, not hurried, but certain. The way skin met skin with quiet purpose. I had imagined it in so many ways, but none of those thoughts came close to the stillness of that moment, to the raw, quiet intensity that settled between us as we touched each other, not like strangers, but like something already known. His body was firm, warm, deliberate. Every motion felt intentional, not rushed. My own hands moved with a desperation I didn't know I carried. When he looked at me, really looked, it wasn't with hunger, but with recognition. I felt seen. Not as a mistake. Not as something forbidden. But as something real. When it was over, I lay beside him, chest rising and falling too quickly, my thoughts a storm of soundless noise. He didn't speak. His arm rested loosely around my shoulder, fingers tracing soft circles into my skin. I stared at the ceiling fan turning in slow, lazy loops, the shadows it cast sliding across the walls. My body felt new and unfamiliar. My mind felt stripped and bare. I didn't know who I was in that moment. Only that I didn't want to leave it. There were no words. None were needed. Everything had already been said in the way we touched each other. And in that silence, in that heat, in that stillness, we had crossed a line we both understood could never be uncrossed. The light seeped in slowly, diffused and soft, slipping past the edge of the curtain and settling across the sheets like a quiet truth. I woke to stillness, not the kind that comes with peace, but the kind that follows something irreversible. My body felt heavy, not with regret, but with weight, of memory, of sensation, of all the things that had been said without a single word. I didn't move at first. I stayed in place, curled slightly on my side, my skin still warm where it had touched his, my breath shallow, careful, as though even the act of breathing too loudly might shatter the moment we had created. My eyes traced the ceiling slowly, watching the pale morning shift across the cracked paint, a silent witness to the night before. He was still beside me. I didn't look, not right away. I could feel the rhythm of his breathing, slow and steady. One arm draped across his chest, the other somewhere between us, close but not touching. The distance between our bodies felt filled with 100 unsaid things, and I wasn't ready to face any of them yet. I stayed still, memorizing the shape of the silence, the fragile comfort of knowing he was real, that it wasn't a dream, that we had both crossed that invisible line together. Eventually, I turned my head, slowly, and looked at him. He looked different in sleep. Softer. Less guarded. The lines on his face were relaxed, his mouth slightly parted, his brow smooth. Without expression, he seemed younger somehow. I let my eyes linger on him longer than I ever had before, allowed myself the indulgence of observing without fear of being caught. I took in every detail, the texture of his stubble, the way the morning light outlined his cheekbone, the rise and fall of his chest. I watched him as if I'd never see him again. Or as if I'd been waiting to see him like this my entire life. When I finally moved, it was slow and quiet. I eased myself out of the bed, careful not to wake him, gathering my clothes piece by piece, dressing in the soft hush of a room that had borne witness to something private, something that could never be undone. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled on my shirt. Not from cold. From something else. Something that lived deep beneath my skin now, a kind of awareness I had never known before. My legs ached slightly, my shoulders sore. Every movement reminded me of where I had been, who I had been with, what we had done. Downstairs, the kitchen greeted me with familiar sounds, the tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the slow creak of the old ceiling fan. I moved like a stranger in my own house, each step deliberate, every sound amplified. I poured myself a glass of water, watched the ice swirl, clink, settle. The taste of it felt too clean, too cold, as though it didn't belong to the same world that existed upstairs. I stared out the window for a long time, the backyard unchanged, the sky already warming with the promise of another hot day. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. I waited for the guilt. I expected it to rise like a tide, to slam into my chest and pull me under. But it didn't come. Not then. Instead, there was quiet. A fragile, trembling kind of quiet. Like the air after a storm. I didn't know if it was clarity or denial, but it wrapped around me gently, giving me space to breathe. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel ashamed. I just felt still. Like my entire body was holding its breath. I heard his footsteps overhead eventually, soft, measured. The sound of movement that felt both distant and intimate. I didn't go back up. I couldn't. I stood at the sink, glass in hand, listening as he made his way down the stairs. I didn't turn to look when he entered the room. I didn't need to. I could feel him there, just behind me. Close, but unmoving. I stared straight ahead, at the light filtering through the window, the branches swaying just slightly in the morning breeze. He moved around me with care. No words. No accidental touches. Just quiet motions, coffee being poured, a cabinet opened and closed, the scrape of a chair across the floor. I finally looked at him. His eyes met mine. They were calm, unreadable, but there was something softer behind them. Not an apology. Not a question. Just acknowledgement. The same understanding I had woken up with. That this had happened. That we were standing on the other side of something. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't break the delicate balance. So we fell back into routine, into the slow, practiced rhythm of cohabiting a house where nothing could ever return to what it had been. He stepped out onto the porch with his coffee. I remained in the kitchen, pretending to read the back of a cereal box I didn't plan to open. Everything felt slightly off, slightly delayed. Like we were ghosts of ourselves, moving through the motions while trying not to disturb the truth that hung between us. By the time my father returned that afternoon, the house had reset itself. Almost. We smiled. We listened. We nodded when he asked about errands and weather. Tom fixed a loose screw on the porch. I folded laundry I'd already washed 2 days ago. It was a performance, not in malice, but in survival. We slipped back into the versions of ourselves we were expected to be, knowing something unspoken now lived beneath the surface. I caught Tom's eyes once across the room. He looked away first. But I saw it, that flicker of recognition, that memory just beneath his calm expression. That night, I lay in my own bed again. Alone. The sheets felt too cold, too untouched. My body didn't know where to rest, my mind refusing to slow. I stared at the ceiling and replayed everything, not just what happened, but the way it ended. The silence that followed. The words we didn't say. The way the day stretched forward without explanation. I didn't know what came next. I didn't even know what I wanted to come next. But I knew something had been given. And something had been taken. And both of us, in our quiet, separate corners of the same house, were trying to figure out how to live with that. Morning came with the same light, the same sounds, the same routines, but it no longer felt familiar. It felt like a version of reality running parallel to the one I had known. Everything moved as it always did, the clock ticked its measured rhythm, birds flitted between branches, the refrigerator hummed its quiet song, but I had changed. There was no going back to who I was before that night. I carried something now, something invisible and heavy. Not regret, not shame exactly, but a stillness that lived just beneath my skin, pressing out from the inside. I dressed in silence, my hands moving through the motions automatically, as if muscle memory had taken over where my mind no longer could. Each piece of clothing felt strange, like armor that didn't quite fit, a costume for someone I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. My face looked the same, but the expression was unfamiliar. My eyes were quieter, my mouth drawn, like something had drained out of me overnight and left only the shell behind. I didn't look away. I stared at that version of myself, trying to understand what had changed and whether it could ever be undone. Downstairs, the house breathed in a steady rhythm, it sounds familiar but no longer comforting. Tom was already awake, sitting on the porch with his coffee and paper, just as he always did. From the kitchen window, I watched him through the glass, the morning sun wrapping around his figure like a shield. He looked as calm as ever, composed, contained, untouchable. I didn't go to him. I didn't open the door. I simply stood there, watching, wondering if he felt it too, the shift, the tremor, the quiet rearrangement of what we were to each other. Throughout the day, we moved around each other carefully. We didn't speak of what had happened. We didn't even glance at it, not directly. But it was there in the space between our bodies, in the way we hesitated before entering the same room, in the way our hands never brushed again, no matter how close we passed. The silence between us was no longer charged. It was something else now. A boundary. A decision. A quiet pact not to acknowledge what could not be repeated. I found myself thinking about the night in fragments. The way his breath had slowed beside mine. The feeling of his hands on my back. The expression on his face when the last of our barriers had fallen away. I didn't relive it with longing or fear, but with a strange kind of reverence. Like remembering a storm that had passed over you without breaking you, but left the landscape forever changed. I didn't know if he remembered it the same way. I didn't know if he wanted to forget. My father remained unaware. His conversations stayed light, his presence steady, his questions few. We played our parts well, Tom and I both. We smiled when it was expected. We responded when spoken to. We stayed just far enough from each other to keep up the illusion. But every time I caught Tom's eye across the room, every time I felt his presence behind me even when he said nothing, I knew the illusion was only a thin layer stretched over something much deeper. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house, floorboards settling, wind brushing against the windows, a distant train passing through the edge of town. My body ached with stillness, my mind circling the same questions over and over. What did it mean? What came next? Could we pretend forever, or would something crack open again, something neither of us could stop? I didn't have answers. I wasn't sure I wanted them. I thought about the version of myself I had been before Tom arrived. The quiet version. The restless version. The one who floated through summer expecting nothing. That person didn't exist anymore. In his place stood someone heavier, more aware, marked by experience he couldn't share and feelings he couldn't name aloud. I didn't regret the change. But I feared the cost. I feared what it would be like when Tom left. Because he would leave. That much I knew. This was never meant to be permanent. He was a visitor passing through a moment in my life, not someone who could stay. And yet, he had left something behind. Something that would linger in the walls, in the corners of the rooms where we hadn't spoken, in the bed where we hadn't made promises. His presence had threaded itself into my memory, quiet and firm, impossible to untangle. The next morning, I heard him packing. The slow zip of a suitcase. The soft thud of shoes being placed beside the door. He moved with purpose, not rushed, but definite. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't offer to help. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands, listening to each sound as if it were a countdown. When he finally appeared in the doorway, our eyes met one last time. There was nothing in his expression to hold on to, no apology, no goodbye, no hint of what we had done. Just that same steady calm that now felt almost cruel. He said nothing. I said nothing. He left. I sat alone for a long time after the door closed. The silence filled every corner of the house, louder than any words we might have spoken. I waited for the weight of it to crush me, for the grief to bloom wide and choking in my chest. But it didn't. What I felt was quieter, more profound. A knowing. A finality. Some moments in life don't need to be spoken. Some stories exist only in the spaces between sentences, in the eyes that linger too long, in the skin that remembers without asking permission. What happened between us would never be told, never be explained. But it would never be erased. I stood up, washed the untouched coffee down the drain, and stepped outside into the late morning sun. The air felt warm. Familiar. Changed. I didn't look back. Because now I knew. There was no going back. And no matter what came next, it would never be the same. And maybe that was the point.